So today's episode is going to be something that I hold very near and dear to my heart, as I know Madison does as well. It is something that we have brought up in previous episodes that we've briefly touched on, and I just kind of want to tap into it a little bit more today. We're going to be focusing on trauma. We're going to focus on single event trauma versus complex trauma, what trauma actually is, and how it impacts you from a child and manifests into your young adolescence as well as your adulthood. But before I get into that, again, let's break down what trauma actually is. A lot of people have a difficult time discerning between traumatic events and the trauma that is sustained from the traumatic event. So let's take single versus complex trauma. Single event trauma would be a natural disaster. It would be a death in the family. It would be a car accident. It would be a broken bone.
It's an isolated event, so it happens one time.
Correct. Then you have complex trauma. The complex trauma is a psychological wound that is developed long-term that manifests subconsciously into your psyche, which could stem as a child from neglect, abuse, sexual assault, and other factors that usually tie in from the family, but also cultural and societal in certain ways like racism and other things like that could have an impact for complex trauma wounding as well. So the wound itself is the trauma. It's that psychological sustained wound that sits with you long term. What happens to you is not trauma. That is the event. How we then
Are shaped through it.
Exactly. How we are shaped through it and the behaviors and the coping mechanisms that we wind up developing from it is the actual trauma. So again, Mads and I are very different. Mads has the science background. I come from a much different area of expertise, and I kind of think that the way to start this conversation and flow into it is having you explain from the science base and the psychological portion, and then that way from there, I can kind of gear in and tap into how I think it affects, and then we can coalesce into a healing ground after that.
Yeah, sounds good. And I think it's important to note within complex trauma, so this is events that are occurring for a prolonged amount of time over and over again. These are repeated events. So it is so subtle but impactful because it is occurring time and time again. What we're going to be focusing on today is specifically childhood trauma. So Ian had named other examples of trauma. Today is going to be on childhood trauma inflicted by the caregiver. So that is only what we are going to be discussing, anything you hear today. So science behind it. Basically, when we are children, our brain is not fully developed. So our environment is shaped through our caregivers. We know when we're a baby, our parents need to look at us. When we're a baby, our parents need to hold us, to kiss us, to soothe us, because we don't know how to do that ourselves. So we look to our parents to be able to be that source of comfort. However, when we begin to have abuse, whether it be emotional, so this could be being degraded, yelled at constantly, even witnessing two parent and growing in an environment who are yelling and fighting all the time, falls into this category. Sexual abuse or physical abuse. And then we have the other side to it that I don't really think many people take as seriously is emotional neglect. I don't know how much people understand the severity of emotional neglect and how impactful and severe it has as an effect for a child growing into adolescence, into their adulthood. So when we look at all of these different types of traumas, we have to look at the child and how does this affect them and why do they end up being the way that they are? When we're a child, our brain is not fully developed and our brain grows from the back to the front. So in that process, our hippocampus, which is designed for memory and learning, and our amygdala, which is our fight or flight and emotional response, is still developed, while our prefrontal cortex is not developed at all, which is in charge of the logical reasoning skills, being able to think properly and being able to have that abstract ability to differentiate between, what is going on. As a child, when you're experiencing abuse, all you know how to do is you're very egocentric because you don't know how to think from different perspectives, but this is done because of me. So if you have a parent constantly abusing you physically, emotionally. If you have a parent who you're trying to talk to them and they're sitting on their phone and just, okaying you, or you say something, they don't even look at you, or they're constantly at work or not home, this is going to tell the child, I am not loved, I'm not seen, so now I need to try harder. So now the child is going to look within and think that something's wrong with them because of the response of the caregiver. Also, it's worth noting that as a child, you don't have any other environment to compare to. So a lot of the times this abuse is not recognized until adulthood because you don't have any other experiences to compare it to. So you see sexual, physical, neglect, all of these different abuses are not seen until an adult comes and thinks about it and is like, oh my gosh, like all of this happened to me and I never even reconciled with it. So all of this is occurring when you're a child. You go into the fight or flight response, which is the amygdala. Now, and within your sympathetic nervous system, your cortisol levels are spiked because you're constantly in that fight or flight response. Most of the time within this response system, you have fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. A lot of the times a child's not going to fight because they know that they're too small. They're not going to run because they want to still have that love from their caregiver. So most of the time they disassociate and freeze, or they fawn, which they start to people please and overcompromise because they feel like the only way to get support and love and care from their parent is to accept and take the abuse while also, doing anything and everything that they say. I feel like I talked a lot.
No, I want you to keep going.
Okay.
I want you to keep going.
So
I'm going to tap in as soon as you're done with the signs.
Yes. So
because I think it's important that you're setting the foundation for what's actually going on internally, psychologically with the child.
And I hope I'm explaining this right because there's just so much to it that there's so many steps. And when a child is put in this fight or flight response, like I said before, the prefrontal cortex is not developed yet. So that logical thinking and reasoning is not there. So now the child is most of the time going to be thinking based off their amygdala, which is their emotional response system. Freeze and fawning are areas of the brain where that would be, within the amygdala, you would have that thought process of either freezing or fawning, because it's an emotional response. So children think out of an emotional response. They don't think out of logic because it's not developed. So this then translates into a lot of self-pity, a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, because again, children only know the environment that they're in. When you're growing up in a chaotic, unstable environment and that's all you know, that is what you think is going to be normal. So when you're constantly triggered in this fight or flight response, all you know how to do innately is to survive, and to biologically, we are meant to bond and connect. So we are always going to still run to our parent despite the abuse, despite the neglect, because we still want to be loved. But within all of this, it's doing such subtle but impactful damage because we don't realize all of our memories and thoughts are being shaped through this negativity. So now you're growing up learning, if someone's, neglecting me, if someone's not paying attention to me, now I have to try harder. So now I'm going to be the class clown, or now I'm going to, constantly sexualize myself and put myself out there because that's how I'm going to be seen. That's how I'm going to be valued. You learn as a child you're not valued or you're not seen when you're dealing with this abuse due to the fact that you don't have logical reasoning skills. You're thinking based off your emotion, and it's the only environment that you're in, so it's normal to you. And it's very subtle. And also, just to add to this, your hippocampus, which is involved in your learning and memory, when your sympathetic nervous system is activated for a prolonged period of time and you're in this stressed state constantly, it actually affects your brain development. And a lot of the times that's why you see sexual abuse victims physical abuse victims, and all of these other victims of childhood trauma don't necessarily recall all of the instances that they've dealt with this, because your hippocampus, your memory center, is impacted by it.
So I kind of want to jump in on that note.
Yeah.
2 notes, actually. One, before I get into that hippocampus thing. So something that I just want to say, I think, and I could have offered this more at the end of the episode as kind of a healing technique, but I think it's very important to say now because you just went into the childhood dynamic. Those coping mechanisms that these children develop, so if they're in an abusive household, and let's say they're in a physically abusive or a mentally or verbal abusive household, a child will normally shell up and revert inwards and become very cold and very silent and very detached.
Yes, that's another big thing.
Right.
Disassociation. So during this whole process, and I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I was going right into
there's disassociation.
I was going right into it.
So you're completely removed from your emotions.
Which is basically where there's a divide between your emotional state and your mental processing. So when you disassociate, you have this disconnect between the two. Now, when you're a child and you're developing these coping mechanisms, you're not wrong for doing so. You know, if you are, the kid that's out of shape and let's say you're bullied for being obese and overweight, that's traumatic as a child. You develop that trauma of that verbal and mental abuse. Some ways that people cope with that is they become the Joker. They become this loud, rambunctious, obnoxious individual. They want to be seen, and it helps them mask that internal pain. There's always that cliche where you hide pain with humor. When you develop those coping mechanisms, which we've all done through the trauma that we've been through, that is okay to do as a child. That is the right thing to do as a child because it keeps you safe in those moments.
Yes.
When you get older, though, okay, because I know you're going to jump in. When you get older, and we'll go into this after, there has to be a disconnect from utilizing those coping mechanisms as part of your now innate personality that no longer serves that broken child anymore.
To piggyback off of you. So, as a child, you are a full victim. You are helpless. You are hopeless. You cannot do anything in this situation, unfortunately, unless go and tell someone, and get help. However, most of the time, like I said before, it becomes normalized in your mind because from a young age, this was what shaped your brain and this is all you know. So it is makes perfect sense for you to not want to seek help because you don't really feel like anything's wrong. You don't love your situation, but to you, it's just almost like, any other household or family because at the time you wouldn't understand that. However, this episode is to inform people about trauma, where it stems from, how it can affect the brain, how it can affect you into adulthood. However, this is not to make a victim or, a self-pity plea. It's not
to perpetuate the ongoing victim narrative that I do find is plaguing society today.
Yeah.
And what I want to get across with Madison also is that this is not going to be an episode where we are sitting here telling you, well, it's okay that you're still living in the predictable past by playing victim to something that happened to you 20 years ago. That's not the purpose of this episode. And going into a lot of what Madison said, like there are a lot of things that wind up coming into play when you do experience trauma. There's a lot of normalities that take place, like experiencing the pain. Pain then transmutes to the grief and to the shame. Then you have a constriction and restriction of psychological and mental and cognitive development. And I know in Madison's field, and especially in my field that I'm in now, everyone listening to this has met an adult in their 20s and 30s and been like, why are they having the mindset of a 12 or 13-year-old child? Something that I think needs to be understood and spoken about, which most people choose to ignore, is that when you're dealing with an adult that has unhealed trauma, you're dealing with a child that has unhealed trauma. People get stunted at the age and the emotional mind state that the traumatic event has taken place, that they chose at that point in time to disassociate from their psychological development and their wounding. So that's something that also needs to be spoken about. And then when you wind up disassociating, you develop that aggressive worldview, towards your exterior, which shells and isolates you even more. Now, I came with notes today, which I normally never do, but there's a lot of things that Madison had spoken on about the survival mechanisms, which wind up shaping and developing the personality. So I want to say this, and then I kind of want to go into how you think from this from a psychological and like a science background. So we spoke about the emotional neglect, which is the disassociation. That's the divide between the emotional and the mental processing. Then you have the abuse and the violence, which causes hypervigilance and that constant fight or flight state, right? Then you have your cultural and societal, which could be bullying, where you wind up disconnecting from your true authentic self because now you feel shame. And then you have the early abandonment, which is where you now fall into a cycle where you choose to continuously replicate the cycle of choosing unavailable people. And so I see your face kind of like, so why?
So I think that those are all actually outcomes to every single trauma.
I agree.
Yeah, there's not one specific. I think that as you're becoming, when you're abused in any sense, sexual, physical, emotional, you can possibly turn into, you look inward. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of guilt.
Right.
There's, if I didn't dress this way, if I didn't talk this way, if I got better grades in school, this wouldn't have happened to me. Everything is more reflected towards the child because they feel like if they could have done better, that their parent would have at least shown them more love and respect and kindness. So there's this constant chase for that love because it's so biologically intertwined with us that we want our caregivers to love us. We want connection as human beings. And I think that the biggest thing of it all is no matter what abuse you have, these are the outcomes that are going to happen. I know a lot of people who have dealt with just emotional neglect and the outcomes are so profound. I mean, people have had their parents physically there, but not emotionally there.
Which I think is even worse.
Which is even worse. And, it breaks my heart to hear some of these stories because the amount of times that these children had basically imposter syndrome growing up and they tried to change themselves so many times because they told themselves that they weren't good enough. They told themselves that mom or dad must not love me or care for me because they can't take 20 minutes out of their day to get to understand what I'm about. Or whenever I bring mom or dad my assignments or homework, they just shoo me away and don't care or say, I could have done better or could have been more like my brother or more like my sister. All of these things that parents do end up allowing for that child to internalize everything, and then they just try to become someone they're not because they don't even know themselves because they'll either just continuously people please. So now you're acting in a way to only appease other people.
That's kind of like that fawning that you spoke
and
about.
You're moving further and further from your true authentic self because all you know how to do is things that are going to impress and make other people happy, but you don't even know how to make yourself happy because you're just so equipped with only knowing how to be loved in a way that's not authentic to truly you because as a child, when you tried to be yourself, you weren't recognized or you were abused or, hurt for it. So the person that was supposed to give you love only gave you pain. So how are you supposed to then feel like you're okay with yourself? And how are you supposed to be yourself when all you've known is being myself is going to cause me suffering?
This can also, and the trauma will manifest in two different ways also. So Madison and I are speaking a lot about kind of the more overly sensitized, where we're constantly in that need of fawning and we're looking to be accepted and we're feeling that pain. There's also a route that I also took for a while, which was the scarring route, which was to completely isolate, shut down, feel nothing, numbness, and you're cold to everything. So trauma can manifest either in a way of oversensitization or desensitization.
I think that's the addiction part, though. They say 75% of people who are addicted come from complex trauma. So it's either that like escape route of like numbness. So, drowning yourself in work, constantly going out and drinking or smoking or using a drug of choice, steroids, pornography. All of these things are to run from reality because you don't want to feel and you don't want to really sit with your feelings of what's going on. So a lot of the times it's to, like you said, disengage, disassociate, and just feel good for a second.
So so now you have people that are going to be listening that hear us, they understand. Maybe it resonates with a few. Maybe some people get defensive. When does it turn into you are the victim as a child to wake up and realize that this narrative and this story of victimhood that you once were allotted and allowed to have no longer should reign precedence over your life?
Well, I think we start off with, because not everyone's self-aware and it's very hard to be. I think we start off with what are the warning signs that you've kind of been through trauma, or maybe that you have to question.
Well, I guess my question to you is, when is it acceptable for an adolescent or a teen or a young adult to finally wake up? I'm not asking for an age. When is it acceptable to take that victimhood and now transmute that into a different story? Like, when is the actual time for somebody to choose to wake up? Does that question make sense?
It does, and I don't think that there's a specific time. I think that even in adolescence, I mean, you can't expect them to fully take accountability. Their brain is still developing.
That I understand.
So the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until you're 25 years old. So I would say, if we're going to put an age range on anything, 25. However, it depends. Some people need to survive and don't have an income and are still living within their family.
Right.
So there's complexities to this, but I think that once you hit adulthood and you're able to really understand and navigate the world and you're independent, you really need to start thinking about, patterns and negative consequences that you have in your life. And I'm going to say something that's really awful and sad. A lot of the times with complex trauma, it is intergenerational. So this happens after parent, after parent, after parent. And I think the saddest part of it all is the parent who inflicts it is always the one who says they're not going to do it to their child. And they always end up doing the same thing to their child and perpetuate their exact childhood and just replicate the process. And I think another thing that is so upsetting is they don't even recognize with themselves what they're doing. So they experience all this hurt and pain and suffering. They promise themselves that they would never do it to their kid, not realizing their normalcy has begun another trauma with their child.
And I kind of want to go into this for a second, because again, this could have been said at the end of the episode, but the thought has sparked and I have to say it now. If you are somebody who has dealt with that type of parental trauma, and it's the trauma of, let's say, just verbal and mental abuse or neglect or abandonment and things like this, sometimes, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong where you were getting at, but I don't think the parents know any better.
They don't.
And that's the thing. So they're still just kids trying, and this is where my own objectivity comes into play.
I don't think it's just kids.
No, and I hear you, but
kids.
No. But what I do think is that you do have a parent where being a parent is new to them, and you have so many years of unhealed, unchecked, unlooked at, buried, deep-seated trauma that although they may have made promises to themselves, there are parents out there who simply, and this is just my own opinion, and this is something that I tell all of my kids that I deal with, sometimes your parents are doing their best without intentionally trying to inflict the pain onto you. So sometimes that neglect, sometimes that emotional abuse, there's so much in them that's damaged and broken that they have never looked twice at. They don't know any better how to relay what they're feeling onto their child. And what I want to get across to those that are listening that may have these ill feelings towards their parents, you have to forgive that. You have to forgive, because we don't walk the paths that they've walked. We don't fully know exactly everything that they've been through. And in order for you to wind up healing within yourself, you're going to have to forgive what they have done to you in order to show some level of compassion towards them, which only fosters compassion inside of you. I'm sorry I had to say it. It just happened. It was a spur of the moment thought. Go.
I don't think you have to always forgive.
Of course you do.
And I don't think that not necessarily is a route of healing. And I think that when a person inflicts so much pain on you, and at the end of the day, there is always compassion and there is always some sort of grieving, for that person. However, at the end of the day, if an adult chooses to inflict the same pain on a child that they may have had, or they were the start of this, intergenerational trauma, because who knows what the child's going to turn into if they're not self-aware of it. All that's telling me is you have these wounds, you have these issues, you have these repetitive patterns in your life, and you're not coming to grapple with it, and you're now inflicting it on someone else, and then that person should now forgive you.
Yes.
Why?
I will tell you why. Because it's not about forgiving them for them. You forgive people for you. Because what happens when you forgive, and this is a physiological fact. Everyone listening, go look it up. I spoke about that aura that our body radiates. When you actually forgive, your heart center opens up. And you know your heart center from yoga and stuff like that. Your heart center opens up. It expands by 3 centimeters. You do not forgive another individual for them and their mistakes to no longer have value, purpose, or to I forgot where I was going with that. You don't forgive somebody in order to forgive them for their behavior. You forgive them so that you heal and that you no longer harbor any animosity. You no longer hold on to any resentment. True forgiveness is a true let go of everything.
I don't think that you have to forgive to let go. And I don't. I think that that's something that works for some, and for others it does not. I personally do not feel like that whole forgiving mentality means that you have like a weight lifted off your chest, because at the end of the day, you're going to forgive a person and you're going to feel lighter, even if they're still trying to inflict that pain on you into adulthood, even if they still have toxic traits, even if they're still perpetuating the same cycle.
And that's the thing.
To me, I feel like that's something where that's why we have boundaries, and that's why we allow certain people in our life. And I don't believe that you have to forgive someone. I believe that you have to have a boundary with what you're comfortable with, and you will be freed from your thoughts and your negativity of things that have occurred to you by setting yourself a threshold and saying, you want to know what? This is people and this is how they're going to act. I know I'm not like that. You are no longer in my life.
But before you set that boundary,
and that's my opinion.
But before you set that boundary, how do you heal from it?
You heal from it from understanding that the way that people treat you is not a reflection of yourself. It's a reflection of how they feel internally and the struggles that they dealt with. But that does not make it right.
Let me ask you a question.
It just goes to show, and I'm sorry, this just came into my mind. This is the exact concept of when people, when people are like, oh, let's just say you're together, you're dating someone, and this is going way off topic, but let's just say you're dating someone, right? And they're like, and they tell you from the jump, like, oh, well, I'm not trying to get serious or ever get married. But they're doing every step to show you or make you feel like they want to get married. But at the end of it, they're like, I told you, though, that I didn't want to get married. So they feel like just because all their actions get demolished just because of what they said.
I'm not even going to tap into that right now because there's 1,000 things I want to say. No, absolutely not. No, okay? No. What I am saying is very, very simple. And again, talking about trauma, this is just a healing technique that somebody can use for trauma, by the way. I know we just went off topic. Going back on, the reason why I say forgiveness is so powerful is because of what it does psychologically to the individual. It allows you to foster a feeling of compassion. Yeah. When you can foster compassion towards another individual who has hurt you, I'm not telling you to keep that person in your life. Setting boundaries is super important. Listen, my father watches this podcast. Him and I had no relationship for years because I set that boundary, but the worst time of my life was when I chose not to forgive him. I set the boundary by cutting him out, but I had no idea how to actually love somebody properly who inflicted pain on me until I learned to forgive. And forgiving him allowed me to learn to forgive myself. I developed a sense of greater compassion inward, and I developed a better understanding that if I could look at an outside factor that has wronged me, like what happened to me when I was 13, all is forgiven. All is forgiven objectively, because I can look at it as, you know what? They were teenagers. They were kids. They had their own problems. They had their own issues. They had their own trauma. To make somebody do that kind of stuff to me, fine, all good. It's no reflection on me, because at the end of the day, how somebody is going to treat you, parents, loved ones, or others, it's no reflection on you as a human being.
It's not.
You have the ability to forgive. I don't know what your point was with that whole thing. But if I'm gonna, you know what, I am gonna say one thing about it. If somebody does tell you that they don't want a relationship with you, but yet they're doing all of the things to show that they will, oh no, you're nodding your head, which they can't see on camera, like I'm going to agree with you. I'm not agreeing with her. When somebody tells you that they don't want a relationship, but they're love bombing you and you are soaking that in, you're the problem. They have set the boundary very clearly that they don't want you. And you are sitting here thinking because of your own trauma and your own need to want to change people and fix people. That is why you stick around. That is the only reason why you stick around, because you try and hold on to that love and you think in the back of your head, I got this. I got this guy. I got this girl. Watch me take this love and transmute this into something that we can be together. Negative. Not going to happen. It was already set. The foundation was already set. The rules and the guidelines were already set. If you choose to ignore that and you try and change it and then you get hurt by it, that is your fault. I digress. I got animated. I'm sorry. That is how I feel.
I am going to say, though, that this is a result of complex trauma.
Speak about it. So we're going full circle.
Yeah, no. We were going to talk about relationship problems.
Yes.
So if you constantly find that you're a person who is scared of intimacy, who does that hot cold, who constantly thinks grass is always greener on the other side, who the second someone becomes close to them and you get some sort of affection, you kind of like fall back.
Yeah.
These are all different...
They're all trauma responses.
Trauma responses.
That's exactly what they are.
Yeah.
It's including the same thing. Like I said earlier, if somebody is constantly choosing to repeat and pick, let's say that...
The relationship.
Right. So let's say that somebody's father constantly was in and out of the picture with their mother. Typically a woman, and I'm sorry that I'm saying this, but this is true, a woman will then search for the same type of mentality in a man that reflects and mirrors the negative qualities of her father, because ultimately she wants to try and change that dynamic. That is a trauma response.
She keeps running to the same relationship, trying to repair it, like she's that child again, trying to get her father back.
Yeah.
Also, I've seen a lot of men whose mothers are very argumentative, hotheads, angry all the time, were very toxic, and they always would chase after women who had that same mentality and become in very toxic relationships where they didn't have the ability to be with the nice girl, quote unquote, or a girl that actually was healthy, because all they knew how to do was enjoy that toxicity, because growing up, that's all
that's what they saw.
They saw.
So my
those
mother,
arguments, the fighting, the yelling, and so
my mom is a
both
saint.
ways.
A saint. I have no idea why I chose the women that I chose.
No.
I don't know about that.
Well, it's not always just that.
I know.
It's other traumas and things, But I just think we have a comfortability of living in chaos when we grow up in chaos. And I think that, like we said before, trauma is very subconscious, and a lot of people aren't even aware of the trauma. So you could be in adulthood, and going back to Ian's point before, of when can we hold someone accountable? You could be in adulthood, and a lot of the times you see anxiety, depression, anger, a lot of anger issues, inability to, what's the word?
Take accountability?
No, not inability to take accountability, inability to...
self-regulate?
With relationships, to commit. A fear of commitment. All of these are different aspects to trauma. And a lot of the time, since these are so normal in society, people don't even think twice or think that there's something wrong or that they dealt with a trauma. Because they could say, oh, yeah, you want to know what? Like, mom used to scream and yell at me all the time. Or, oh, yeah, okay, like dad was screaming all the time and yelling at my mom and degrading her and this, that. But whatever, that's it. Not realizing that they are perpetuating the same cycle.
Correct.
So I think that it gets very tricky, because a lot of people can't even recognize and reconcile with the trauma and deal with it, because they don't think anything's wrong with them.
Right. And a lot of people will find, and this is something that I suffered with for a long time, that feeling of chaos was comfortable for me.
Yes.
That feeling of abuse was comfortable for me. That feeling of neglect was comfortable for me. The feeling of being cheated on was comfortable for me. The feeling of being love bombed was comfortable for me. So all of those were my trauma responses to the things that I dealt with that wound up manifesting into that type of response that I kept perpetuating in every single dynamic and relationship, regardless if it was friends or relationships that I dealt with. And what?
No, something's really blaring to me too, because Gabor Mate.
Yeah.
he said something where, his trauma response was him being a workaholic.
Oh, yeah.
And he said at the time it was so normal to him because he felt like all I was doing was providing, and I was going to work and I was doing these 80 hours. And how could that be that something was wrong with me, until he actually sat back and was like, wait, this is a trauma response to X, Y, and Z. So all of these addictive behaviors and all of these really negative thought patterns, behavioral patterns, the way that you react and are angry, impulsive, all of these are a response to something that you've never tapped into.
Correct.
And, I had one person in my life who his life was so chaotic and crazy, and I couldn't even fathom a lot of what was going on because it was just really dark, deep stuff, and he didn't even know.
Because it
was so
his place of
normal
normal.
to
That's
him.
his normalcy.
So
right
healthy
there.
to him was uncomfortable. Healthy to him was, what are you talking about? That's crazy. I'm not gonna, go and take a walk and sit with my feelings. And it was like, Maddie, why do you always talk about feelings and things of that sort when I would try to help out my friends?
There's also those people that are constantly, they have to be moving all the time.
Oh, that's a big
one. Yeah, so I cannot say him. So there is somebody who I'm very close with who I actually just had a conversation with the other day, and I said, do you ever relax? What is your relaxing like? I don't relax. Do you ever just sit and smoke a joint, just kind of tune into your own body, your own feelings? Do you ever just do breath? Never. He is either, the second he's out of bed, he's moving, working, going to the gym, doing this. He does not sit down until he gets into bed at night. He's constantly on the go. That's a trauma response as well.
Yes.
If you can't sit with yourself because you have this feeling, which he admitted, a feeling of discomfort when he doesn't know what to do, that's that inability to self-regulate. That's that inability to get your nervous system back down in check and just be calm. That's a trauma response.
Which is why we have our sympathetic nervous system, which sparks adrenaline, and our cortisol. And then we have our parasympathetic nervous system, which brings that calm. So a lot of the times when we deal with trauma, like I said before, going back to the science, your body is in that sympathetic nervous system the entire time. So to be in that parasympathetic and to be zen and calm and chill is very weird.
Also for
and
that,
uncomfortable.
And that sympathetic nervous system, what a lot of people don't understand, and this just sparked a whole nother thing. He's always sick.
Yes.
So here's the thing, and a lot of people,
yep.
So here's the thing, right? So when your body's in that constant sympathetic nervous system and it's spiked, and you have this fight or flight, your cortisol skyrockets. Mm-hmm. That is an increase in hormonal imbalance, which then your tissue winds up attacking itself, and you develop all these autoimmune diseases. Yep. If you notice, and again, Gabor Mate always talks about it, women suffer horribly the most from autoimmune diseases because they have a horrible time regulating, and I'm not finger pointing, but they have a difficult time regulating their emotional state, their sympathetic nervous system, which causes and triggers all these onset autoimmune problems. It's bad, and he's always sick. Lupus, constantly has a cold, arthritis, all exactly.
It's so true.
So when you have these continual trauma responses, put your psyche to the side for a second. You're also damaging your physical body. Now
you're deteriorating yourself.
Yeah, you're deteriorating internally, and actually it ages you. Oh. You just don't look good. So you now have a disconnect from the body. You have a disconnect from the mind. Your mind is sick and your body's sick.
Yeah. And there's a lot of disassociation there, with emotions, with the trauma response of being able to sit still, and you don't even know how you feel. So it's like everyone's running on E, and it's like to sit and do something normal and calm.
It's uncomfortable.
Is uncomfortable. And I think that it just, oh my gosh, it's so important to know that the physical is so tied into this.
It's so tied in. You can't.
People don't know that.
You can't disconnect your mental psyche from your physical. And it's like what you and I spoke about last time with the whole fight or flight and being in that entire mode of fear where it's that limbic nervous system, right?
Yeah.
So you Your brain doesn't differentiate between past, present, and future. It only knows what you tell it. So if you're constantly telling your brain to be on go, 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 where your sympathetic nervous system is in that constant heightened state, your body now only knows go, go, go because your cortisol is skyrocketing at the same time. You have a direct relationship between the two literally deteriorating and failing you at the same time.
Yeah. Well, your brain is attached to the spinal cord and just runs down.
There you go. Say it, girl. Say it.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of tie in what we're saying, and I think I'm going to run through just really quickly. So the science.
Are you giving like a thesis overview?
Yes, because I want to get into now the reconciling and recognizing all of these different components, and then now how do we seek help? So that's why I'm doing it, so people understand.
I like it.
So we have parent trauma, and you could jump in whenever you want and add to it. We have childhood trauma from abuse from a parent, whether it be physical, sexual, emotional, or neglect.
Correct.
As a child, our prefrontal cortex is not developed, so we don't have the ability to logically think or reason. As a child, they're also egocentric, and that's not egocentric in a negative way. They have an inability to see different viewpoints due to the brain not being fully developed. So now they go right into the limbic system, and that's really where children's thought processes are at as they grow up. So when they're getting inflicted with pain or they're being neglected, they are going to think with an emotional response. That is where the amygdala and the hippocampus is for learning and memory, for emotional response. Now what you're doing is you're putting this child in a fight or flight response where they're either going to freeze or fawn. So that's disassociating from their feelings. That's people pleasing, saying yes, being super attached to parents despite all of the abuse being inflicted, because all we want as children and in our adolescence is that human connection. Also, your child or you as a child is now only piecing together negative parts of an environment. So yelling, screaming, hitting, slamming things, breaking things. This all becomes their norm. All they know is this. So now they're growing up with this perception of not only the world, but their selves of, with I'm not good enough, I'm useless, I need to do things to be seen, I'm not valued, so I need to overachieve. And this is where you ultimately get to, a crossing path where a lot of the times children will act out or internalize. So you see depression, anxiety, you see people pleasing, you see overcompensating with sexualization, boys getting into a lot of fights, being argumentative, all of these things, yes, are developmental stages in a teenager. However, when you see them very profound and impacting every single day life and turning into oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder as a boy or a girl, but more so boys, that is something to look at. So then they're going into adulthood.
Also, hold on. So the oppositional defiant disorder, for people that don't know, it ties very closely in with ADHD, all right? And it's more of a anger, rebellious kind of mannerism. Where
defiant, very
defiant. So
does not listen to authority.
No, and it comes with a lot of volatility behind it. So I know you just briefly said it, so I just wanted to get that out there.
I should have explained that.
Oh yeah, so ODD is different than ADHD, very different than OCD.
Yes.
Go back.
Yes. So then as an adolescent, you will either see them internalize or externalize, however their coping mechanism has been. Now well into adulthood, and keep in mind, we're still not at the 25-year mark where the prefrontal cortex is fully developed. So we're still not able to grapple with our experiences and what has happened to us until now we have opportunities for other experiences to enter our world. So going to maybe friends' houses or starting to date or seeing other people. This is when that abnormality is going to come out. And this is when your brain actually starts to piece together, oh my gosh,
Something might be wrong with me.
I don't think that this was normal.
Yeah.
Like, my mom and dad don't sit there nicely at the table and ask me, hey, Johnny, like, I'm so proud of you and you got great grades. I get home and my dad, slaps me or hits me, or my mom doesn't talk to me, or when I try to talk to my parents, they're not even looking in my direction, or I'm constantly being degraded every time I say something and my feelings aren't worth it. So a lot of the times these children learn to just kind of do what's told, just to not, be in harm's way.
100%.
So that's how now we develop this sense of inability to really understand what has happened to us. But now we are an adult, and now we fast forward, and we were a victim of trauma, of complex trauma that was ongoing, and it was very rough, and it was brutal and devastating, and we were depressed and internalized things, and no one heard us, and helpless, hopeless. We were there at one point. Now, what do you do as a 29-year-old man or woman with this trauma? I'm going to start it off. I say, because we know I say this, you look at patterns. How are your relationships? Are you constantly running from intimate relationships? Do you have a fear of intimacy? Do you have a fear of commitment? Are you constantly in toxic relationships? I think that that's number one. And also looking at friendships, relationships with friendships, and can you keep friends? Are you going for friends that are bad influences on you? That's what I would say for mine. What would one be for you?
It would definitely be pattern recognition, which is the most important thing, because you're also going to deal with a lot of people who refuse and are reluctant to look at their own patterns.
And that's okay. Not everyone needs help.
They're not ready to embrace change. They're not ready to understand from an objective point of view that there might be a problem going on. So when you are starting this process of, okay, maybe it's time that I utilize my surroundings to mirror back to me exactly maybe some of the things that I'm starting to notice were a discrepancy in my own life growing up, and how they may not have served me to the best of my well-being. Yeah. Now you look for the pattern recognition, like you said. It's seeing what traits have I developed that I feel no longer serve me. Are there also things, and this is a big one for me, what are my triggers? It's writing down your triggers. Now, everyone, and we said this in one of the other episodes, everyone throws that word around like it's nothing. Yeah. I'm triggered. Shut up. Okay? You cannot always be triggered. I'm sorry, but that word has become desensitized now and has lost its value. If you, let's say, are in a relationship and you're triggered by your partner not reaching out to you multiple times a day, maybe sit with that feeling and say, okay, why am I feeling this? This is where, when Madison and I did the first episode, developing genuine curiosity within for these patterns. Yeah. So now you develop the pattern recognition of, okay, why am I feeling this when I'm not getting this? Why have I chosen the same person to date over and over that has turned out the exact same way? Why am I comfortable choosing to be in a situation where I am not emotionally, mentally, or spiritually fulfilled? It's that pattern recognition with questions. That's important. And
emotional responses. Are you always angry all the time?
Oh, so big.
Are things constantly bothering you at the snap of a finger? Are you constantly sad all the time? You really need to look at certain behaviors that are impacting your daily functioning. And listen, not everyone who has complex trauma is going to want help. Not everyone is going to need it, because at the end of the day, I think we're talking to an audience of people who actually genuinely know that something's wrong and they want to seek help. They just don't know where to start. We are not sitting here saying if you were abused or if you were neglected, you need to get help. Because if you don't want to, at the end of the day, you don't want to.
Correct.
And no one's going to force you, and that's your prerogative. And that's very important, I feel like, for both of us to say. We're not trying to force anyone to feel like they need to seek it, but we're here for the people who want it, who want to be better, do better, not have that intergenerational, negative parenting, traumatic experience for their child. And looking at the triggers of your emotional responses, of your patterns within relationships,
100%.
Of even, I feel like, can you hold a career and a job?
That's a big one. So that kind of hit me right in the nuggets.
Yeah.
When growing up, I couldn't hold a job to save my life. Great worker, but couldn't hold a job, and very impulsive with everywhere that I went into. Bouncing off what you said about being triggered, every time that somebody's triggered, it is a doorway and an invitation for you to look within. The second that you develop that reactivity to that subconscious response where you kind of want to subjectively snap, that is them offering you a invitation to open your own doorway, to reground yourself, to recenter yourself, and look at this as to, okay, well, why am I actually reacting to this? Because 99.9% of the time, unless somebody is being really intentionally malicious towards you, your response to that situation that occurred is coming from you having a trauma response to it. And I think that that's super important to get across. Allow your triggers to be a welcoming sign and kind of like a signpost in the fog to pointing you into a direction to where you want to start looking at it with curiosity.
Another really good one, if you could never say no.
That's fawning. That's
the fawning, the people pleasing. Yeah. Are you overly extending yourself, even if you don't want to, even if it won't fit into your schedule? Are you impacting your health, your emotions, your kind of Zen space to just say yes to people because you're scared they're going to be mad at you? That's a big one too.
And this is what I want to say, and it's okay to be selfish.
Yes.
It's okay to set your boundaries. It's okay to tell people no. And what's going to happen when you start developing boundaries, when you start to heal, a lot of people are going to look at you like you're some villain in their story. But really what you're doing is you're creating these boundaries to self-preserve your own peace and understand that you've now developed this sense of compassion, which can in turn look as a sense of ferocity towards others, but it's not. It's okay to be selfish, and it's perfectly fine for you to put your foot down and say that you're not dealing with something anymore.
You're going to lose a lot of people because people don't want to be healthy, and they want to choose the easy way out and that victimization. So when you finally put yourself first, it's abnormal for others, and you become the boring friend or person, or you become, someone who now is rude or mean, or now you don't care about me. And that's not what it is at all. It's just you learning that certain people in certain places are not always going to be healthy for you.
They don't serve you. They don't serve this version of yourself. And one of the last things that I want to say, which I think is super important for people to understand and to prepare for, healing your trauma is the most painful thing you will ever do in your life.
It takes a long time.
It takes a long time, and it's going to be brutal, and it's paradoxical in a sense. You are going to wind up having to feel broken all over again in order to heal. You are going to have to shatter yourself and then put yourself back together. And this whole journey that you're going to go on of realizing and reconciling all of these different traumas that have taken place in your life, it's going to resurface a lot of triggers. It's going to resurface a lot of wounds. And it's up to you at the end of the day to objectively look at them with a place of compassion and care and self-love, and understand that this is needed, and you have to regress in order to progress.
And you almost have to reparent within yourself, because a lot of the times the biggest issue is the shame of not feeling good enough, feeling useless, feeling like you're ugly, or you're not funny, or you're awful at your job. Like all of these really negative, shameful thoughts and self-dialogue comes from that trauma. So you almost have to like reframe and catch yourself, and what is that negative thought trap and what is the realistic reality of it all. So I'm useless at my job, or I don't know what I'm doing ever. Log and, track
story
a pattern.
Versus state, like you said.
Yeah, story versus state. Track, that your week at work, and track what you've been successful at. You'll see a lot of in your mind is not what's really going on. It's just what is being told to you. So really cognitive reframing, and, that's just reframing your thought process and really catching those thoughts and understanding not everything I believe is truth. And yes, at one point I did feel low and not seen and valued, but now I have this person in my life who makes me feel valued. Oh, you want to know what? My friend calls me 2 times a day or once a week, and she keeps asking me what I want to do. So I am seen. So my job always loves the way that I complete these projects, and I'm always the first one to be asked to do it. I am valued for my work. Look at the facts and catch yourself in the fantasy.
I want to say one more thing. I'm sorry. One more, because you just triggered something, and I know I say it every single episode. Every single episode, I will repeat it all the time. Have grace and compassion with that younger version of yourself. Yeah. That little child that was damaged and broken and abused and neglected and assaulted, that is the strongest version of you. That is the toughest version that you have ever been, because it survived all of your hardest days. And I fully believe that the second that you show grace for that version of yourself, and you allow yourself to say, you know what, thank you for developing those coping mechanisms. They just no longer serve this version of me now. Now you can let go. You can learn to detach from those styles of coping and develop new ones which will serve this higher version of self.
Yeah. And I think a lot of highly successful people and high functioning people have dealt with a lot of complex trauma, and could be your neighbor and friend and people around you that you don't even know about. So the last thing that I will say is, don't be embarrassed to tell your story. Be vulnerable, because the more that you open up and you allow for your story to shine through, and you basically live through it, in talking about your experience, you're going to find that so many people around you have dealt with other, experiences, and being able to relate on things like that, and knowing that, you want to know what, other people have also were dealt bad cards, and we could all get through this together. And I think just coming together as a whole, and like I've been saying, us human beings thrive off of bond. That is what we are here for, to bond, to connect, and to build relationships. Build relationships off what has happened to you. Be someone to tell that story. Be someone to be the encouraging person who's going to give someone else light, and really use your hardships for good, and know that at the end of the day, a lot of what you went through, you would not be where you are today if you never experienced hardships, because if you don't know hard, you will never know good. So use all of the bad to do right in life, and love, and it builds compassion, and be kind, and
forgive, and forgive, and forgive.
But don't forget.
Perfect.